Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, I would like to welcome everyone to the Raymond R. Webb Jr. Lecture. The School of Social Work and the community were saddened by the loss of an outstanding alumni in 2006. Ray Webb was an advocate and practitioner of community mental health. He directed Allegheny East Mental Health Retardation Center from 1969 until he left in 1989 to take the helm of the Pennsylvania Community Providers Association. His work and leadership were recognized in 1980 when the National Association of Social Workers Southwestern Pennsylvania chapter recognized him as its Social Worker of the Year. And the School of Social Work selected him as its Distinguished Alumni Practitioner that same year. In addition, for many years, Ray chaired the school's Alumni Society and lent his knowledge and skills to the school's administrators, faculty, and students. We memorialize Ray's contributions to our field. The contributions were made by Mimi Preslak, Mel Haber, Jim Gavin. Jim Gavin is president of Community Care Behavioral Health Organization. They have partnered with the School of Social Work to create the Raymond R. Webb Jr. Endowment Fund. This fund will provide financial support for graduate students in the School of Social Work who are pursuing careers in public welfare. In addition, it supports this lecture, which is also designed to celebrate Webb's spirit. Here today to introduce our lecturer is Associate Professor, what's your name now? Professor Danny Rosen. Thanks, Dan.
Good afternoon. Dorothy Van Soest, PhD and MSW, is a professor and former dean of the University of Washington School of Social Work in Seattle, with over 30 years' experience as a social work teacher, researcher, author, and administrator. Her publications, as you expect, include numerous articles and several academic books, including one entitled Diversity, Education for Social Justice, Mastering Teaching Skills. But what's very interesting to learn about her is that she's also a novelist. And she has one novel that is out already, which is called Sheila's Trifecta. And it's a novel about three women immediately following their death who share their life stories, revealing their soul's journey on earth, their birth and death cycles, and the natural aging transition from childhood and beyond. And she has two that are in the works. I find this incredibly annoying, that she has time to write all of these articles and books and lecture, and then also now is a novelist. So, in her 1997 book, The Global Crisis of Violence, Common Problems, Universal Causes, Shared Solutions, she states, "The greatest and most important challenges for social workers is to become global professionals who understand the deeply embedded and submerged structural foundation of violence, which feeds violence at the institutional and individual levels in an increasingly interdependent world. To reclaim our professional roots in community activism, peacemaking, and internationalism." Dr. Van Soest has a national and international reputation and is a highly sought-after speaker about issues related to diversity, education, anti-oppression, social work practice, social and economic justice, and violence prevention. We're fortunate to have her here today to discuss her talk, Confronting Our Fears and Finding Hope in Difficult Times, Social Work as a Force for Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Van Soest.
What a great audience. Whew, I didn't expect this many people. Now I'm nervous. I'm really delighted to be here and honored to be asked to be part of the speakers series here at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. As I was preparing the speech for today, I worried that maybe starting with confronting our fears might sound too pessimistic. But then I thought, well, finding hope and social work as a force for social justice, that's pretty optimistic. And so it went as I prepared, back and forth between pessimism and optimism, seeing the glass as half empty, seeing the glass as half full. I started to feel like both of the two friends in one of my favorite jokes. Got to start with a joke, right? The two friends, one an optimist and the other a pessimist, could never quite agree on any topic of discussion. One day, the optimist decided he had found a good way to pull his friend out of his continual pessimistic thinking. The optimist owned a hunting dog that could walk on water. His plan, take the pessimist and the dog out duck hunting in a boat. They got out into the middle of the lake, and the optimist brought down a duck. The dog immediately walked out across the water, retrieved the duck, and walked back to the boat on the water. The optimist looked at his pessimistic friend and said, "What do you think about that?" The pessimist replied, "That dog can't swim, can he?" I've organized my speech into 3 parts. The first part is blatantly pessimistic. It's about 3 gruesome realities of today's world. My intent is not to create more pessimism, but to acknowledge and confront our fears as the first step in solving our problems. The second part is unabashedly optimistic. It's about how we can find and revive hope in order to be an effective force for social justice. Winston Churchill once said that a pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. The third part of my talk includes 10 suggestions about how we as social workers can employ our pessimism to confront our fears and activate our optimism to sustain us, even in tough times like these. We'll move on to part 1. Without arguing about the relative badness of the times in which we now live compared with difficult times in the past, the reality is that we live in a time of considerable uncertainty and risk. In the first part of my presentation, I will highlight 3 interconnected points of distress: our economy, the violence of war, and threats to our democracy. We're all painfully aware that we are living through the worst economic slump since the Great Depression. While the crisis touches every American's life and reverberates around the world, something else has been going on, something that seems to be consistently underestimated as a problem. It is this: while most everyone's share of our nation's income has been declining, a very small number of people have been receiving an ever larger share that has created an astounding and growing centralization of power and wealth that is tearing at the social fabric of our society. Consider the numbers. The top 1% now pockets about 23% of all income. Not incidentally, the last time the top 1% took home such a disproportionate share of the national income was 1938. The richest 20% now owns 84% of the wealth. Let me say that again. The richest 20% owns 84% of the wealth. While the average wage for the top earners in 2009 was $84 million each, 1 in every 34 people who were wage earners in 2008 failed to earn a single penny in 2009. What for white Americans has been a great recession amounted to a virtual depression for a substantial number of African Americans whose unemployment rates stood at 15% in May of this year, compared with the overall national rate of 9.7% at the same time. Marian Wright Edelman, founder and head of the Children's Defense Fund, has poignantly documented the incredible disparities of wealth. "Something is awry," she wrote, "when the income of a single health insurance executive is more than the combined income of over 9 million families. Something is indeed awry when a worker making $10 an hour would have to labor for 10,000 years to earn what one of the richest 400 Americans pocketed in 2005. Something is awry when sloppy, greedy mortgage lenders inflate the housing bubble, and when it finally bursts, apply their same avaricious instincts to home foreclosures with potentially disastrous results for consumers. When the gutting of the American dream of home ownership disproportionately devastates minorities, and the subprime fiasco ripples through communities of color like miniature Hurricane Katrinas. The loss of wealth for people of color in the housing crisis could potentially reach $213 billion, a raising of wealth and opportunities for African Americans and Latinos for generations to come. Something is awry when no one regulates or even monitors the Wall Street gamblers on steroids with all their tricks and traps. When Wall Street paid people a near record $145 billion in 2009, while America was mired in the worst recession since the 1930s, and 1 out of 6 Americans couldn't find a full-time job. Something is awry when corporate executives took home millions while betting on risky mortgage-backed investments that ultimately brought our financial system to its knees. As Professor Mimi Abramovitz from Hunter College so eloquently wrote, and I quote, "And then the high-rolling gamblers and critics of big government took welfare. Many of the same people who thought it was just fine to deprive millions of women of critical resources and punished them for their lack of personal responsibility by slashing welfare benefits and food stamps. Many of the same people who, with remarkable consistency, would do for health care and Social Security what deregulation did for banking, a proposition that should terrify us all," unquote. Take a deep breath with me for a minute. There's one more thing to be said about economic inequality, and that is that the people at the top pay less in taxes compared to everyone else. The effective federal income tax rate for the 400 taxpayers with the very highest incomes declined by nearly half in just over a decade, even as their pre-tax incomes grew 5 times larger. Some of the same people who say we have to make deep cuts in public services and not do any more to help the ailing economy seem eager to cut checks averaging $3 million each to the richest 120,000 people in the country by making all of Bush's tax cuts, not just those for the middle class, permanent. That would cost the federal government $680 billion in revenue over the next 10 years, nearly all of which would go to the richest 1% of Americans, the majority of it to the richest 1/10 of 1%. Economist Paul Krugman is right to ask, when Congress won't take action to revive the economy, pleads poverty when it comes to protecting the jobs of school teachers and firefighters, will it declare that cost is no object when it comes to sparing the already wealthy even the slightest inconvenience? If it does, it will be hard not to lose faith in America's future," unquote. We didn't get into this situation of such incredible economic inequality overnight. Structural changes in the economy have bestowed fabulous wealth on a tiny sliver at the top, while undermining the living standards of the middle class and absolutely crushing the poor. It took decades of increasing privatization and deregulation, shredding of the safety net, demonizing of unions, eliminating employment training and jobs programs, skyrocketing higher education costs, and deterioration of the national infrastructure. Not that there wasn't plenty of growth at the same time. There was. But the economic benefits went overwhelmingly and unfairly to those already at the top. Yet, while they cry out for solutions to our economic problems, many Americans grossly underestimate how much inequality our economy produces. Maybe that's why we don't hear much about how such injustice is tearing at the social fabric of our society. But instead, we hear that unemployment benefits shouldn't be extended because the jobless are spoiled and that there are plenty of jobs for those who are willing to work, as if the unemployed are merely more welfare queens. That government is too big, and we need more of the wonders of the unregulated free market that got us into this mess in the first place. That we have to cut Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. Even though, in case you don't know, you probably do, Social Security has a $2.3 trillion surplus. There's enough there to last us through the 2040s and beyond. It didn't cause the deficit, and cutting Social Security will not help the deficit. And so it goes. What we really need to do is risk the wrath of those with wealth and power and stop the redistribution of wealth upward, instead of whacking the average wage earner, the middle class, the poor, the old folks. As Robert Reich, in his new book, Aftershock, explains, we came to this Great Recession because we did not learn the larger lesson of the 1930s, that when the distribution of wealth gets too far out of whack, the economy needs to be reorganized so the broad middle class has enough buying power to rejuvenate the economy over the long haul. Told you it was going to be pessimistic. A second area of distress, an endemic cycle of violence, is connected to the economy, as will become apparent. The response to the horrible events of 9/11 has resulted in a violent cycle of death and reprisal that continues today. The cycle started when 9/11 was used as a reason to go to war with Iraq. So far, a total of 150,000 Iraqi deaths have been documented since the invasion began, 80% of them civilians. The 400,000 recently revealed Pentagon documents relating to the U.S. invasion and occupation exposes in excruciating detail what many of us feared, that Iraq became a bloodbath of unnecessary killings, civilian slaughter, rape, torture, and people being beaten to death. So far, some 5,000 U.S. troops have been killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the burden of sacrifice, like our economy, falling unevenly across the spectrum of American society. When America goes to war, it is the poorer and less educated who more often die in combat. This gap is by no means a recent development. All U.S. wars since World War II to the present conform to the classic definition of rich man's war, poor man's fight. Long after the guns and bombs have been silenced, the cycle of violence will continue for our soldiers. Approximately 300,000 current and former service members suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and 320,000 have experienced a possible traumatic brain injury. Stressed out, depressed, and dependent soldiers are seeking help for their mental difficulties at a rate that is overwhelming the capacity of available professionals. The suicide rate among veterans aged 20 through 24 is 2 to 4 times higher than civilians the same age. The cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan constitute a form of violence in itself. According to Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, it will run to more than $3 trillion. How do we get our heads around $3 trillion? If you counted one number a second, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, it would take almost 85,000 years to get up to 3 trillion. If you were to give $1 million, if you were given $1 million a year to spend, it would take you 3 million years to blow $3 trillion. And now Joseph Stiglitz has recently revised his figure to 4 trillion, noting that the number of veterans seeking care from the VA system since 2001, which is about 600,000, far exceeds his earlier projection. $3 trillion, $4 trillion. And the lion's share of that money isn't going to support our brave soldiers. To illustrate, consider this. While the average Army private's income is $25,942 a year, the average income of CEOs of the top military contractors is over $9 million, with the highest paid CEO, Robert Stevens of Lockheed Martin, making over $24 million. And overbilling the United States government by military contractors is commonplace. So commonplace that it makes the news in little paragraphs in the back pages of the newspaper. The cost of fighting 2 wars hampers our ability to solve other problems, and thus the cycle of violence that was started on 9/11 circles back to our economy and the violence of poverty and inequality here at home. Domestic programs like education and health care for our children were deemed too expensive, while we spent $4,563 per second in Iraq. That's $12.3 million for the duration of my speech, if I speak for 45 minutes. The money spent on war each day, is enough to enroll 50,000 children in Head Start for a year or make college affordable to 60,000 low-income students through Pell Grants. It is only by educating and mobilizing Americans that our problems will be solved. An informed citizenry is the bedrock of democracy. This leads me to the third source of distress, a threatened loss of democracy. A politics by bullying is systematically attempting to silence or misinform people. Fear and smear election campaigns repeat blatant lies to get people to act against their own self-interests. The Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling opened the doors for unidentified donors and corporations to flood the airwaves with misleading and dishonest ads. In effect, the rich and corporations can now determine what opinions can be heard. While unlimited campaign spending is a problem, the real threat to democracy is making meaningful discussions about candidates and policies impossible. The premise of the First Amendment is that citizens must be free to speak, not only because this is a fundamental right of human existence, but also because democracy depends on deliberations among reasonable people. In dialogue with others, our presuppositions are challenged. We revise our opinions based on alternative ideas and come to reasoned judgments different from what we would have concluded before. We know it happens in the classroom all the time, right? But corporations do not reason. They are incapable of deliberation and dialogue. Their minds cannot be changed. Their presuppositions cannot be challenged. They cannot enter a town hall and engage in discussion with their fellow citizens. The point is that when the political process becomes nothing more than promoting corporate self-interest, then those with the most money win, and democracy loses. As Bill Moyers recently said, money in politics is a dagger directed at the heart of democracy. In addition to an informed citizenry, another bedrock of democracy is voting. Voting rights sound like such a solid thing. Yet it has been anything but that over the course of our nation's history. In the not too distant past, the right to vote was limited to people who owned land, to white people, to men. And today, the United States is the only democracy in the world that denies people who have done prison time the right to vote, a disproportionate number of them African Americans. Voter suppression, a long and ugly tradition, continues to thrive through the use of an endless variety of obstacles, such as outright intimidation, false notices instructing people to vote on the wrong day or at the wrong place, blocking phone lines used to arrange rides to the polls, making voter registration drives more difficult, using scare tactics to keep poor and minority folks away from the polls, requiring voters to present a voter ID, and not providing enough voting machines, as happened in several states in 2008, where African American voters had to wait in line for hours, while voters in white areas voted easily and quickly. I don't know about you, but the pessimist in me is on full alert right now. I'm way out of whack. We need a joke. I feel like the twins in the joke that was actually a favorite of President Reagan's. There were two 5-year-old twins who had developed extreme personalities. One was a total pessimist, the other a total optimist. Their parents became so concerned about it that they took them to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist met with the pessimistic twin first. Trying to brighten his outlook, he took him to a room piled to the ceiling with brand new toys. But instead of yelping with delight, the little boy burst into tears. "What's the matter?" the psychiatrist asked, baffled. "Don't you want to play with any of the toys?" "Yes," the little boy bawled, "but if I did, I'd only break them." Next, the psychiatrist met with the optimistic twin. Trying to dampen his outlook a bit, he took him to a room piled to the ceiling with horse manure. But instead of wrinkling his nose in disgust, the optimist emitted just the yelp of delight the psychiatrist had hoped to hear from his brother, the pessimist. Then he clambered to the top of the pile, dropped to his knees, and began gleefully digging out scoop after scoop with his bare hands. "What do you think you're doing?" the psychiatrist asked, just as baffled by the optimist as he had been by the pessimist. "With all this manure," the little boy replied, beaming, "there must be a pony in here somewhere." So now we come to the part of my speech where we look for the pony. The hope in all the manure I just laid on you. When faced with the kind of threats that I've described, we have two choices. We can determine that the world is an unjust place, or we can determine that it is a just place and decide that the folks that aren't doing so well must somehow be responsible for their suffering. A belief that the world is just can act as a psychological distortion that encourages support of political agendas focusing on individual effort rather than structural change, like blaming the poor and the unemployed for having an insufficient work ethic. It is when we face the fact that as fragile human beings, we are subject to indifferent and sometimes malevolent forces more powerful than we are, that we can find responsible ways to embrace the realities of vulnerability while working to address the impact of injustice. The point is not to assert that the world is just, but to help make it so. The challenge, of course, is to figure out what to do and how to believe that anything we do will make any difference. The challenge is as much psychological as political. As Paul Loeb says in his book, Soul of a Citizen, quote, "Society has systematically taught us to ignore the ills we see and leave them to others to handle. Understandably, we find it unsettling even to think about the huge crises facing us. We're led to believe that if we can't solve every one of the problems, we shouldn't bother to become socially active at all. Whatever impulses towards involvement we might have, they're dampened by a culture that demeans idealism, enshrines cynicism, and makes us feel naive for caring about our fellow human beings or the planet we inhabit," unquote. As social workers, we know this is called learned helplessness. And the antidote to helplessness is hope. Defiant, resistant, persistent hope. We can find that hope by turning to history, to the stories that teach us to find common solutions by seeing the world clear-eyed and yet acting with courage to make change in spite of the evidence, to believe in spite of the evidence, and then watch the evidence change. Nothing buoys the spirit and fosters hope like the knowledge that others faced equal or greater challenges in the past and continued on to bequeath us a better world. Yet when we turn to history, we need to see it as it really was. We need to be careful not to create myths about our heroes that make it harder for us to act. Let me give you an example. The Rosa Parks story, as popularly told, is that one day she refused to move to the back of the bus, and that started the civil rights movement. The story makes it sound like she acted completely on her own, that she acted kind of unconsciously because her feet were tired, so she just didn't move, and that her inaction led to instant change. None of this is true. Rosa Parks acted as part of a community. She had been active in the NAACP for 12 years and was the secretary for the local chapter. She went to the Highlander School Civil Rights Center the summer before her arrest, where she strategized and brainstormed with people who had been active before. Rosa Parks didn't make a spur-of-the-moment decision, and her action on that bus was very conscious. She didn't single-handedly give birth to the civil rights efforts. She was part of an existing movement for change at a time when success was far from certain. And many people were involved, often in seemingly insignificant ways. Their stories show us that change is the product of deliberate, incremental action. Sometimes our struggles will fail. Other times they bear modest fruits. And at times they trigger a miraculous outpouring of courage and heart, as happened with Rosa Parks' arrest and all that followed. We get hope from knowing the real stories of courage, not mythical, magical courage like Superman, but the courage of ordinary people who acted despite all their uncertainties and doubts. When people are given a real opportunity to make a difference, they step forward in huge numbers. Progressive groups are connecting online in record numbers. The story of one such group, MoveOn.org, any of you members? All right. That story shows how a small action, when combined with the small actions of many people, can turn into a roar. The day after 9/11, Eli Pariser, I think that's how you pronounce it, was only 20 years old and living in Boston. Fearing that vengeance would bring even greater tragedies, he created a small website that included a petition to President Bush and other world leaders, asking them to use moderation and restraint in responding to the attacks, rather than using the instruments of war, violence, or destruction. Then he emailed the petition to 30 friends. Within days, his inbox was filled with thousands of emails from strangers. His servers started to crash. Within 2 weeks, 515,000 people from 192 countries had signed the petition. Before long, Eli connected with the founders of MoveOn.org, where he is now campaigns director. And MoveOn has become a major force for progressive change, its membership growing from a few 100,000 to 5.2 million as of 2009. The reality, nonetheless, is that change is slow. When I get discouraged, my hope is reactivated by turning to the stories of people who persevered over time and no matter what. My favorite August by Gail Collins is just such a story. I'll give you part of it. The story in American history I most like to tell is the one about how women got the right to vote 90 years ago this year. It has everything: adventure, suspense, treachery, drunken legislators. But first, there was a 70-year slog, which is really the important part. We always need to remember that behind the almost every great moment in history, there are heroic people doing really boring and frustrating things for a prolonged period of time. That great suffragist, an excellent counter, Carrie Chapman Catt, estimated that the struggle had involved 56 referendum campaigns, 480 campaigns to get legislators to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party campaigns to include women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. And you thought healthcare reform was a drawn-out battle. The great thundering roadblock to progress was, wait for the surprise, the U.S. Senate. All through the last part of the 19th century and into the 20th, attempts to amend the U.S. Constitution ran up against a wall of conservative Southern senators. So the women decided to win the vote by amending every single state constitution one by one. There were 5 referenda in South Dakota alone. Susan B. Anthony spent more time there than a wheat farmer, but she never lost hope. The great day was coming, she promised. It's coming sooner than most people think. I love this remark, because she made it in 1895, more than 25 years before women got the right to vote. Sometimes I fantasize about traveling back through time and telling my historical heroes and heroines how well things worked out in the end. I particularly enjoy the part where I find Vincent van Gogh and inform him that one of the unsold paintings piled up over in the corner will eventually go for $80 million. But I never imagined telling Susan B. Anthony how well women are doing in the 21st century, because her faith in her country and her cause was so strong that she wouldn't be surprised. Well, it came down to 1918, when it finally came to the House of Representatives. It needed 2/3 of the vote needed for passage. It was barely within reach. One congressman who had been in the hospital for 6 months had himself carted to the floor so he could support suffrage. Another, who had just broken his shoulder, refused to have it set for fear he'd be too late to be counted. Representative Frederick Hicks of New York had been at the bedside of his dying wife, but left at her urging to support the cause. He provided the final crucial vote and then returned home for her funeral. The Senate failed to follow suit, but Woodrow Wilson pushed the amendment through the next year, and the states started ratifying, came to one state short of success. 90 years ago this August, all eyes turned to Tennessee, not Pennsylvania, Tennessee. The only state yet to ratify, with its legislature still in session. The resolution sailed through the Tennessee Senate. As it moved on to the House, the most vigorous opposition came from the liquor industry, which was pretty sure that if women got the vote, they'd use it to pass prohibition. Distillery lobbyists came to fight bearing samples. Both suffrage and anti-suffrage men were reeling through the hall in an advanced state of intoxication, Carrie Catt reported. The women and their allies knew they had a one-vote margin of support in the House. Then the Speaker, whom they had counted on as a yes, changed his mind. Suddenly, Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the House, a 24-year-old no vote from East Tennessee, got up and announced that he had received a letter from his mother telling him to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt. I know that a mother's advice is always the safest for a boy to follow, Byrne said, switching sides. We celebrate Women's Suffrage Day on August 26th, which is when the amendment officially became part of the Constitution. But I like August 18, which is the day that Harry Burns jumped up in the Tennessee legislature waving his mom's note from home. I told the story once in Atlanta, and a woman in the audience said that when she was visiting her relatives in East Tennessee, she had gone to put a yellow rose on Harry Burns's grave. I got a little teary. Well, actually, she added, it was because I couldn't find his mother. When we know our history, we can see how far we've come and how we got here. The common thread that weaves all the stories together is the story of democracy, a story that is still unfinished. We don't know whether it will end in tragedy or in joy or somewhere in between. But I believe we social workers are destined to play key roles in shaping the story. Which leads me to the third part of my talk. Let me start with 3 assertions. First, I believe that to work for social justice means to work for peace, because peace is more than the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Second, I believe that social workers are inherently well-suited for peace and social justice activism. Underlying our social work values, ethics, and practice principles is what I call a professional peace consciousness. It links peace to issues of social justice, human rights, and development, issues that are the heart and soul of social work. And third, the personal qualities and skills required to be effective social workers parallel those that are needed for peacemaking and community activism. You know, things like empathy, communication. In order for social work to be an effective force for change, I suggest that we need to find ways to use our pessimism to confront our fears and our optimism to activate and sustain our hope and energy. So now I want to offer 10 suggestions on how we might do that, suggestions aimed at helping us to keep going, even in the hard times when our spirits begin to flag, or even after a particularly difficult election. Number 1, use your imagination. Allow yourself to imagine a better world and hold on to this imagination no matter what evidence there is to the contrary. For example, imagine that all children are provided with what they need. Imagine the United States investing $75 billion per year in federal funds to ensure that every child has enough to eat, access to better education, and a place to call home. Imagine that our nation can afford that, because it can. After the quick bailout of Wall Street, there should be no doubt that the government can come up with billions of dollars to deal with the problem when it's deemed important enough. An investment of $75 billion per year would equal less than what the 2001 tax breaks alone gave to the wealthiest 1 in 100 Americans each year. Imagine the world you would like to inhabit, and then believe it is possible to create such a world. Number 2, be a critical, analytical thinker with a heart. Don't unquestionably ingest what you see or hear or read in the news. Think about what you are being fed and ask uncomfortable questions. Strive for enlightened perspective. When someone uses the words social change or social justice, don't assume they mean what we mean. Ask who is saying it and what they mean. Here's an example. Charles and David Koch have for years spent millions of dollars to bring about social change, to advance what they call their radical philosophy. Who are they? Billionaire oilmen. What change platform, what social change platform are they working for? The abolition of Social Security, the abolition of minimum wage laws, the abolition of gun control, all personal and corporate income taxes for starters. And when you hear them talk about their strategy, listen to how much it sounds like social work strategies. They talk about education and grassroots organizing and lobbying and political action. Think critically. Ask questions. Number 3, know that no action is too small, that every action counts. Taking even one small step on the journey changes one's perspective on the landscape. Action, either practical or symbolic, overcomes the inertia and apathy connected with the absence of hope. Don't hold yourself up to the perfect standard. You don't have to be everything. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to be impossibly eloquent and confident and certain in a way that nobody is. That is a trap. It keeps us from taking action. No matter how small each individual effort might seem, know that every single one of us can make a difference because it is our combined efforts that produce change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. Number 4, don't let those who have power intimidate you. No matter how much power they have, they cannot prevent you from living your life, thinking independently, speaking your mind. Don't believe the messages you may have been told that what you feel doesn't matter, that what you believe is ridiculous, that what you envision is worthless or impossible. Follow the still small voice that whispers the truth to your heart. Number 5, pair a deep-seated sense of social justice with pragmatism. Don't assume that people are either with us or against us. They are not arrayed along a simple ideological spectrum from right to left, nor do they occupy any given spot consistently. Many people who are not ideologically driven, but who may hold strong opinions on various issues, make up a vast center. Be willing to work with that center to enact reforms that are a beginning rather than an end point in the process of societal transformation. As American history consistently instructs us, this is pretty much the only way things change in our system. Over time, reforms like Social Security, Medicare, the Voting Rights Act, and yes, health care reform can add up to a kind of revolution, one that succeeds without bloodshed or widespread destruction of order, property, or necessary institutions. Number 6, reframe issues to effectively reach more people. Our brains allow us to have contradictory worldviews and to go back and forth between them. Many people have both conservative and progressive worldviews, but on different issues. George Lakoff, in his excellent book, Don't Think of an Elephant, should be required reading in any macro class, calls such people biconceptuals. To reach the millions of biconceptuals, we need to reframe the issues to match the progressive part of their worldviews. Lakoff makes the point that frames or worldviews trump facts every time. We tend to want to lay facts on people. If you just knew the truth, if you just knew the facts. But ideology, he says, or worldview trumps facts. So what he urges is that we don't just negate the opposing position's claims with facts, but instead tune in and reframe issues according to what's important to people. Number 7, never give up. Making our country and our world fit for our children and grandchildren is a task for marathoners, not sprinters. Keep coming back. Remember, there is no silver bullet that will unlock all our problems at once. Change is a complex and long-term struggle that requires persistence. Number 8, know when to step back. When we feel our red-hot rage, no matter how justified, at the trampling of our country's values, it's time to take a breath and de-escalate. Take a look at the spiraling anger of others and make the choice not to ratchet it up. The theatrics of rage can easily backfire. Righteousness, when not rooted in humility and focused on results and persuasive power, offends more than it attracts and falls victim to its own arrogance. As Cornel West says, we need the courage to be impatient with evil and patient with people. Number 9, hold our leaders accountable. Hold yourself accountable for holding our leaders accountable. I know that some politicians at all levels are telling people that they shouldn't even bother to ask for anything that costs money, that deficits are terrible, our economy is sinking, we're at war, and it is just the wrong time to ask. Don't believe them. History proves otherwise. Consider this. The Social Security Act of 1935 was passed in the depths of a depression. Disability coverage under Social Security and women being included in welfare and AFDC were both passed during the Korean conflict. Federal involvement in higher education started during the Cold War, when millions of dollars were being tied up in competition with the Soviet Union. The Civil Rights Act, Medicaid, Medicare, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the WIC program, the Economic Opportunity Act were all passed during the Vietnam War. Each of these laws were lobbied for and passed during a time when our country was either engaged in costly foreign wars or bad budget years. Many of those laws took years to win, but when people held their leaders accountable, even during times of turmoil, they made them happen. Number 10, believe that in the long run, justice will win out. Cast your lot, as Adrienne Rich wrote, with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. So I hope you'll go away today with 3 main points. Yes, we live in bad times. Facing that reality is the first step towards solving our problems. 2, there is hope. Our most serious problems are our common problems, and they can be solved only through our common efforts. We are part of a community of like-minded souls stretching across the globe and extending backward and forward in time. And number 3, social workers can be an effective force for social justice by employing pessimism to confront our fears and activating optimism to find and sustain hope. I want to close with a quote from my favorite historian, Howard Zinn. An optimist isn't necessarily a blithe, slightly sappy whistler in the dark of our times. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Thank you. Is that okay?
What a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, standing. Some of you are standing.
That was absolutely a wonderful talk. Wow. I'd like to say something to you in front of so many people. Actually, we've known each other for quite a while. But this morning at breakfast, she said that this was her swan song. This was her last talk. I'd hate to believe that that's true. I really hope that you'll continue to speak. That's an absolutely wonderful talk. So again, thank you so very much for that talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lauren Fitzpatrick, Lauren, would you please come up? We give just a token of
I wanted to thank you on behalf of the School of Social Work and the Doctoral Student Organization.
Thank you.
She said she had a great time with you guys today.
I did. I had a great time with you guys this morning.
We had a good time too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we open it now?
We'll open it now, later, how we want to do it.
Is there time for questions? Or did
We
I
have
go
room for
too
questions,
long?
yeah. We have, why don't we take a few questions now, or comments?
Any
We have ti-
comments or
we have time
questions?
for- We have time for a few?
Yeah. You know that asking is actually reference. It's unfortunately references. I'd be happy to send it to you.